Have you ever wondered how historically accurate the Civilization games are? I mean, a standard game of Civilization is anything but historical for sure. But what about the individual elements in the game? They're obviously inspired by real history. Their effects aren't just randomly assigned to them. Well, the goal of this series is to explore this concept by looking at each individual wonder of Civ VI and trying to see how its actual historical background informed its in-game representation. In this video, we'll be looking at some of Civ VI's classical era wonders, exploring their history through the lens of their in-game features, and hopefully learning something along the way. I will say that I was surprised at how some very unassuming designs actually make a ton of sense, and are very coherent with their historical counterparts. Personally, it has given me a new appreciation for them, especially for some of the most obscure wonders. So, let's start our historical journey by traveling towards ancient Persia, to talk about a wonder that perfectly exemplifies the meaning of imperial authority. At the height of the Persian Empire, delegations from across the known world would make the long journey to Persepolis, carrying the finest treasures their territories could offer. The hall that received them was built to make an impression that no visitor would ever forget. That hall was the Apadana of Persepolis, which was built in the ancient Persian capital under Darius the Great in 515 BC and later restored by Artaxerxes II. It served as a ceremonial space where representatives from across the vast Achaemenid Empire would gather to present tribute to the king. In Civilization VI, the Apadana provides the following bonuses: +2 slots for great works of any type, and +2 envoys whenever a wonder, including the Apadana, is built in the city. So, to explain these effects, we first need to take a closer look at the Apadana itself and its purpose. The Apadana was constructed at the height of the ancient Persian Empire, a period where its lands spanned from the slopes of the Himalaya to the Nile Delta and across Anatolia. But not all of this territory was ruled directly by the Persians. In fact, most of it was ruled by local rulers, who had to pay tribute to the Persian leader, named for that reason as the King of Kings. Greek historians of the time wrote about Persepolis, describing it as the richest city under the sun, and the Apadana is where much of that wealth was brought and presented, arriving from all across the known world as part of those tributes. The reliefs on the palace's southern staircases depict processions of subject nations of the Achaemenid Empire, Greek city-states, the Egyptians, Babylonians, and many other tributaries of the empire are shown bringing gifts to the Persian king. These gifts were the finest luxuries of the time, from intricate textiles to ornate jewelry. Civilization VI represents those lavish offerings as great works, which is a pretty fair abstraction in my opinion. Now, to explain the second bonus, we first need to take a look at what envoys represent in Civilization VI. They more or less play the role of diplomatic influence, how major powers project their reach and assert control over smaller city-states. So, the more envoys you control, the bigger your prestige, reach, and power projection is. The bonus of the Apadana in-game basically ties those envoys to the splendor of your capital. So let's talk a little about Persepolis, the capital of the Achaemenid Empire during its golden age. The Apadana was likely the most impressive structure in the city, but it was far from the only one. It stood on the Persepolis terrace, alongside the Gate of All Nations, the Hall of 100 Columns, multiple palaces, and a vast royal treasury. Persepolis itself was, at the time, one of the most prosperous cities in the world, something that would have naturally inspired both admiration and loyalty among its many tributary states. I believe that the envoys that the game provides the player who owns the Apadana do a very good job at describing this connection between splendor and power projection. The more impressive your civilization appears, the more influence it can exert outwards. The wonder requires the political philosophy civic. As I described in the previous segment, the enormous Achaemenid Empire in its golden age had a well-established political structure, where subject nations across its vast territories paid tribute to the King of Kings. The Persian kings would allow different cultures to exist under their imperial rule, keeping local governors in power, while the tribute-bearing delegations reinforced the royalty to the central authority of the Persian Empire. The Apadana was, fundamentally, a representation of this form of governance, a central hall where all this wealth from faraway lands would be delivered and made visible. Political philosophy is an extremely broad term, but the Apadana definitely fits under its domain. It is, quite literally, an architectural expression of how imperial power was organized and sustained. The wonder must be built adjacent to a capital. It is quite clear that the Apadana was a representation of the central authority that was present in the old Persian capital of Persepolis. It could not exist and fulfill its role as an audience hall in any other city, so I believe the requirement is quite justified.
My ancestor Darius made this Apadana, but it was burnt down. By the grace of Ahura Mazda, Anahita, and Mithra, I reconstructed this Apadana.
The in-game quote comes from Artaxerxes II, referencing the reconstruction of the Apadana after it had been destroyed. Artaxerxes invokes deities of Zoroastrianism, such as Ahura Mazda, the sky god and main deity, Anahita, the goddess of water and fertility, and Mithra, the god of the sun and friendship. Apadana started construction in 515 BC, under the orders of Darius the Great, and finished during the reign of Xerxes I. However, the palace was partly destroyed or decayed and was rebuilt by Artaxerxes II in 359 BC, as referenced in the quote. The Apadana was finally destroyed by the army of Alexander the Great, when he ordered his army to burn and loot Persepolis. This guy just keeps popping up in these videos. Overall, the Apadana is a pretty elegant design. It ties together culture, diplomacy, and political authority into one wonder that reflects how the Achaemenid Empire actually functioned. It is a very nice example of how Civilization VI manages to capture historical facts in otherwise unassuming designs. Looking at the bonuses at a glance, they don't seem that especially thematic, but diving deeper into it, it's very satisfying how well the features of the wonder reflect the actual history of the ancient powerhouse that constructed it. But now let's go a bit forwards in time and travel west to find a symbol of authority belonging to an even larger empire. The Colosseum of Rome was the largest amphitheatre ever built in the ancient world, commissioned by Emperor Vespasian of the Flavian dynasty and completed under his son Titus in 80 AD. It could seat up to 80,000 spectators and hosted gladiatorial combat, animal hunts, and public executions for centuries. In Civilization VI, the Colosseum provides the following bonuses: +2 culture, +2 loyalty, and +2 amenities from entertainment. These bonuses are applied to each city center within 6 tiles of the wonder. To understand these effects, we need to look at what the Colosseum actually meant to the people of Rome and to the empire as a whole. The games held inside the Colosseum were free to attend. The emperors of Rome subsidized them deliberately as a tool of governance. The Roman poet Juvenal famously described this strategy as bread and circuses, a term that is still used to this day and describes the idea that the population can be kept content and kept in line through food and entertainment. The games were spectacles on a scale that the ancient world had rarely seen. Wild animals sicked in from across Africa, elaborate staged naval battles, and gladiatorial duels that drew crowds from across the empire. The Colosseum was, in a very real sense, an instrument of political control dressed up as public entertainment. Civilization VI captures this spectacle as amenities, a resource that represents population happiness, entertainment, and general well-being. The bonus is applied perfectly to the wonder, since the Colosseum would provide entertainment like nothing else in that period of history. The culture bonus points to how the Colosseum played a less obvious but integral part in Roman society. The Colosseum was the centerpiece of Roman public life and identity. The games and spectacle that took place in its premises were deeply embedded in Roman culture and promoted what it means to be a Roman. It helped to form a collective cultural identity that promoted certain values like strength, imperial authority, and social hierarchy. Even the events that weren't gladiatorial in nature reflected this. Smaller theatrical performances held in the Colosseum often had mythological themes, and sometimes would end with the live execution of criminals, where the condemned would play the characters that died in the tales. It is pretty crazy how much violence was in the center of almost every event in display. The loyalty bonus is perhaps the most direct reference to the actual history of the Colosseum. Loyalty in Civilization VI represents how strongly a city's population is attached to your civilization, rather than drifting towards the neighbors. The Roman games were a deliberate projection of imperial generosity. By providing spectacle on such an enormous scale, the emperors of Rome were constantly reminding their subjects and subjects in surrounding territories of the power and grandiosity of Roman rule. But something of note is that all of these bonuses are not only applied in the city that built the Colosseum, but in every city that is close enough to it. I believe this serves a double purpose. First, to show how well the Romans were at controlling their enormous empire while keeping their population happy, and second, to show how this influence and control radiated outwards from Rome, the Colosseum being something of a representation of its strength and imperial authority. I think it could also be a small nudge to the famous phrase, "all roads lead to Rome," since I like to imagine the bonus as a way of saying that people from all surrounding cities will visit the Colosseum to admire its spectacle. The Wonder requires the Games and Recreation civic. I mean, this is pretty straightforward. For sure the best suited civic for the Wonder. The Romans formalized public entertainment as a civic institution, investing enormous state and private resources to host shows, games, and entertainment of all sorts. The Colosseum is the ultimate expression of organized public entertainment in the ancient world, and its entire purpose revolves around leisure. Games and recreation as a civic is the recognition that this structured entertainment is a function of organized society, rather than a private matter. The Colosseum is the most literal possible expression of that idea. The Colosseum must be built adjacent to an entertainment complex with an arena. The Colosseum did not emerge in isolation. It was part of a broader infrastructure of Roman entertainment that included smaller theatres, bathhouses, and local arenas. Having the Colosseum require an entertainment complex is basically saying that the Wonder could not exist without already established infrastructure centered on appeasing the population, which is fair. I do, however, have a minor personal gripe with the fact that the complex needs to have an arena as a requirement. Civ VI does this with other wonders as well, like the Great Lighthouse requiring a lighthouse to be present in the city. I don't like this. If an arena already exists in the city, why go through the trouble of making the Colosseum? I much prefer the Civ V way, where the Wonder would provide the player with the appropriate building, instead of requiring it. I'm sure it's done for game balance reasons, but it has always bothered me.
While the Colosseum stands, Rome shall stand. When the Colosseum falls, Rome shall fall. When Rome falls, the world shall fall.
The in-game quote comes from the Venerable Bede, an 8th century English monk, writing centuries after the fall of Western Rome. By his time, the Colosseum had already become a symbol larger than the building itself. Bede symbolically ties the fate of the Colosseum to that of the Roman Empire and to the fate of the world. It's obvious that the influence of the Roman Empire was still very much present long after the empire's collapse, and the Colosseum had always been a representation of it in the eyes of the world. Well, the Colosseum was damaged by earthquakes in the 5th and 14th centuries, and much of its stone was later quarried for use in other Roman buildings, yet it still stands, so according to St. Bede, we're still safe. Overall, the Colosseum is one of the cleaner wonder designs in Civilization VI, where I can't think of anything else that could be done better in regards to its history. Even if I find the inclusion of having an arena present as a requirement to be very redundant, I do enjoy how the bonuses that the Wonder provides spread around your civilization. It reflects the empire-wide ambitions of the Romans perfectly, and is a good example of how the game translates a structure that was simultaneously a piece of architecture, a political tool, and a cultural institution into a set of mechanical effects. Next, let's head out to the Aegean Sea. towards a small island city-state that constructed a bronze giant that has intrigued historians and explorers for centuries. The Colossus of Rhodes was a giant bronze statue of the Greek god Helios, erected in the port of Rhodes, an ancient Greek city-state, around 280 BC. Constructed by the Rhodian sculptor Haris of Lindos, it was one of the tallest statues of the ancient world. It stood for only 54 years before being toppled by an earthquake, but its reputation was so immense that it was listed among the 7 wonders of the ancient world regardless. So how does Civilization VI translate this bronze giant into gameplay? In Civilization VI, the Colossus provides the following bonuses: plus 3 gold, plus 1 Great Admiral points, and plus 1 trade route capacity along with a free trader. To get around to explaining these bonuses, let's first go back a little to understand why the Colossus was built in the first place. During the later part of the 4th century BC, Rhodes was a mercantile republic, which was seen as a small but powerful naval force in the Aegean Sea. During that period, there was a wide conflict in the Hellenistic world regarding the successor kingdoms, which were the partitioned conquests of Alexander the Great following his early death. Rhodes maintained a careful neutrality, but this did not sit well with Antigonus Monophthalmus, who feared the Rhodians would eventually side with his rival, Ptolemy I Soter, because of their good trade relations. When Antigonus asked the Rhodians to aid him in his attack on Ptolemy, they refused. As a response, the Macedonian general ordered his son Demetrius I Poliorcetes to besiege the island. This siege, though, turned out to be quite costly. Demetrius amassed an attack force more than 6 times larger than that of the Rhodian defenders. Many tactics were used in order to capture the port city during the year-long siege, but to no avail, leading to a peace negotiation between Demetrius and the Rhodians. One of the terms of the treaty that was finalized was that all the siege engines, equipment, as well as the massive helepolis, which was constructed just for this endeavor, would be left on the island. Much of that equipment, along with the helepolis, was sold, and the proceeds were used to fund the construction of the Colossus, transforming the instruments of war into a monument of victory. Maybe not the most practical use of that huge amount of gold, but certainly a memorable one. Some of the weapons from the failed siege were supposedly melted down and repurposed in the statue's construction. I wonder how Demetrius felt about that. I bet it must have stunk, at least a little bit. The statue was a depiction of Helios, the Greek god of the sun. Helios was not among the most prominent deities in the wider Greek world, but he was the patron god of Rhodes, where his cult held particular importance. By constructing such an immense statue in his honor, the Rhodians would be basically trying to elevate their deity to the level of that of Zeus or Athena. The one tasked to construct this unprecedented statue was Haris of Lindos, a sculptor born in the island. We will get a bit more in depth about its construction in the later segments. So that was a brief historical background of the statue, but to actually explain the effects that the game attributes to it, we also have to examine the city-state of Rhodes during that period. The city's harbour was one of the busiest in the Aegean, which helps explain why the Rhodians were so keen to remain neutral during this time of conflict in the area. It sat at a crossroads between the Greek world, Egypt, and Anatolia, and the majority of its wealth resulted from the vast quantity of trade that passed through it. In that way, we can justify both the gold bonus and the free trade route and trader that the wonder provides the player, imagining the Colossus as something of a representation of the commercial reach of Rhodes. The Great Admiral bonus highlights another aspect of Rhodian power. Rhodes was an important trading port, but that's not where their significance ends. The island boasted a powerful and respected fleet, which it used to ensure commercial security. Strabo wrote about Rhodes at length, noting that its fleet exceeded that of anywhere else he knew. Diodorus similarly described Rhodes as the strongest sea power and the best governed city of the Greeks, mentioning that it had single-handedly taken on the task of clearing the Mediterranean of pirates on behalf of the Greek world. If these accounts are even partially accurate, then it seems pretty fair for the game to attribute Great Admiral points to the civilization that was able to construct the Colossus. The wonder requires the shipbuilding technology. We could treat this as an extension of the aforementioned Rhodian naval supremacy. Rhodes' identity as a city-state centered around the sea, and having a large and powerful fleet is a big part of that. The Colossus seems like a very fitting physical monument to express the relationship between the city-state's prosperity and the sea. The wonder must be built on coast, adjacent to land and a harbour. This is a pretty self-explanatory requirement that is basically a one-to-one representation of the Colossus's real-world placement. According to accounts of the time, the Colossus was built in the port of Rhodes, but its precise location remains unknown. Some historians have also argued that the Colossus could not have been built directly in the port of Rhodes, as it seems unlikely that the Rhodians would be okay with a statue as large as this, taking so much valuable space. What we do know is that his famous pose, that with its leg on separate sides of the port, is most probably a fabrication, as there is no evidence of it in any written form.
At Rhodes was set up a colossus of 70 cubits high, representing the sun. The artist expended as much bronze in it as seemed likely to create a dearth in the mines.
The in-game quote comes from a short ancient text called the Seven Sides of the World, attributed to Philo of Byzantium, though that attribution is disputed. Scholars believe the text was more likely written by a different, later author, possibly as late as the 4th or 5th century AD, who either adopted the name or was confused with the earlier Philo. It's interesting how many things are disputed about the history of the Colossus. We know that an earthquake knocked it down 54 or 56 years after its construction, and that its fallen remains were a popular attraction for over 800 years, but that is pretty much where the certainties end. Colossus's actual location, its posture, and the eventual fate of its remains are all a matter of debate to this day, with very few and vague sources to go on from. What is certain though is that the image of the Colossus has stuck in the cultural zeitgeist, a testament to how powerfully the statue captured the imagination of the world even in its brief existence. It's no coincidence that the Statue of Liberty, one of the most recognizable wonders in the world, shares many similarities with the ancient Colossus of Rhodes, even being described as the new Colossus in its inscription. So, overall I have to say that I'm a little bit underwhelmed about the bonuses that Civ gives to the Colossus. Almost all of them are basically derived from the fact that Rhodes was a seafaring merchant city-state, so the effects end up feeling a bit generic. It's not that they don't fit though. As stated, we don't really know that much about the Colossus, so making the wonder be more related to the things we do know about the people that built it does make sense. If we treat the Colossus as being a representation of Rhodes, as the economical and mercantile powerhouse of its heyday, the design is perfectly appropriate. Just in the opposite side of the East Mediterranean, we can find the city that hosts our next wonder, a monument dedicated to the acquisition of knowledge. Most of you have probably heard of the Library of Alexandria, and the story of its destruction. But what was the library actually like at its peak? How did it function? And how much of its famous demise is actually true? The Great Library, also commonly known as the Library of Alexandria, was the largest and most significant library of the ancient world. Founded in the port city of Alexandria in Egypt, most likely during the reign of Ptolemy I Soter, and expanded under his successors, it aimed to collect all the knowledge of the known world in a single place. Scholars from across the Mediterranean were invited to study there, and texts were gathered, copied, and preserved on a massive scale. From philosophy to mathematics, every form of knowledge would be present within its halls. So how does Civilization VI treat this ancient wonder? In Civilization VI, the Great Library provides the following bonuses: +2 science, +1 great scientist point per turn, +2 great works of writing slots, boosts to all ancient and classical era technologies, +1 great writer point per turn, and a random technology boost whenever another player recruits a great scientist. Okay, so these are a lot of effects, but I'm happy to say that they all make sense and are relevant to the Wonder's history. An important thing to get out of the way first, before we explain its bonus, is that the Library of Alexandria was not exactly a library in today's sense of the word. It was an active center of research, arguably the largest of the ancient world. Scholars from all over the Mediterranean and the Middle East were working there to both produce and preserve knowledge. The Science Guild and the Great Scientist Point are a very straightforward translation of the library's accumulated knowledge in all things scientific. Some of the greatest minds of the world either worked there or were closely associated with the institution. Euclid worked in Alexandria, and Archimedes is known to have studied there, while Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the Earth in the city. It is really difficult to overstate how many ideas and scientific output were created in Alexandria during its golden age. This also helps to explain the tech boost that all ancient and classical technologies receive when a player constructs the Great Library, since its presence undeniably led to countless scientific breakthroughs. Unlocking the wonder in-game essentially means your civilization has gained access to a concentrated record of everything humanity had figured out so far, which is about as clean a mechanical translation as you could ask for. The other bonus regarding tech boosts, however, is a bit more interesting. From the moment a player builds the Great Library, they receive a random technology boost whenever another player recruits a great scientist. This is a bit of an unusual bonus, but it can be tied very nicely to the actual history of the wonder. The Library of Alexandria was in many ways a scientific hub for its age. The purpose for which it was built was to concentrate all possible knowledge that was present at the time into one place. This meant that every researcher had a really big incentive to travel to Alexandria, to do research, but to also interact with other intellectuals. This meant that the library was deeply connected to the wider world of science, a place where ideas flowed through effortlessly, each one contributing to an ever-expanding pool of knowledge. I find the way that Civ VI abstracts this information to work very well. When someone somewhere makes a discovery, your civilization benefits from it, because the Great Library provides you the infrastructure to absorb and build upon that information. The last set of bonuses have to do with writing, and are also well-founded. The library was not purely a scientific institution. It housed vast collections of poetry, drama, and philosophy, and the scholars who worked there produced literary and critical work alongside their scientific output. The Ptolemaic kings were also known to pursue original manuscripts aggressively, allegedly requiring all ships docking in Alexandria to surrender any scrolls on board for copying, oftentimes keeping the originals and returning the copies. A little bit ruthless maybe, but very effective if your goal is to build the greatest library in the world. In any case, the great works of writing slots reflect that obsessive accumulation of literary and cultural texts. The +1 great writer point per turn is also well justified. The Library of Alexandria played a major role in the development of literary criticism. Scholars like Aristophanes of Byzantium and Aristarchus of Samothraki worked on editing, organizing, and analyzing some of the most important works of Greek literature. They introduced things like punctuation systems, textual comparison, and detailed commentary, shaping how texts were read and understood. This kind of work shaped literary scholarship for centuries, and Civilization VI reflects that by tying the wonder to great writer generation, representing a place where literature was studied, interpreted, and developed further. The wonder requires the recorded history civic. It is true that civilizations had been recording history for thousands of years before the construction of the Great Library. However, one of the main purposes of the Library of Alexandria was to collect and catalogue all these texts into one place. Callimachus was an ancient Greek poet who was active in the library. One of his greatest accomplishments was the creation of the Pinakes, a comprehensive catalogue listing all of Greek literature up to that point. The Pinakes are considered to be the first library catalogue in the West, and the most famous of them organized works by author and subject, a model that would then spread to the rest of the Mediterranean and would influence how libraries were organized for centuries. Sadly, as with most works of the Great Library, only fragments of the Pinakes remain. The wonder must be built on flatland adjacent to a campus with a library. The Great Library was not an isolated building. It was part of a much larger intellectual complex, the Museum, an institution dedicated to the Muses, where scholars lived, worked, and conducted research. This included lecture halls, study spaces, and collections that extended beyond a single structure, with additional storage later housed in places like the Serapeum when the main library ran out of space. Requiring the wonder to be next to a campus points to the fact that the Great Library was the centerpiece of a larger infrastructure focused on the acquisition and preservation of knowledge. I will say that, as with the Colosseum, I do not enjoy the requirement of a library being present in the city. I have been over this and it will come up again in the future, so I'm just noting it here briefly. The Civ V Great Library provides a free library in the city, which is way better in my opinion.
We can roam the bloated stacks of the Library of Alexandria, where all imagination and knowledge are assembled. We can recognize in its destruction the warning that all we gather will be lost.
The in-game quote comes from Alberto Manguel, an Argentine-Canadian writer and one of the most prominent authors on the history of reading and libraries. The quote is from his book, The Library at Night. He mentions the Library of Alexandria as a symbol of collected works, one that carries a warning about the fragility of accumulated knowledge. The destruction of the library, whenever and however it actually happened, has become one of the defining cultural anxieties of Western civilization, a reminder that nothing that is gathered is guaranteed to survive. And on that note, the destruction of the library is itself one of history's most debated questions. There was no single catastrophic burning, despite what popular imagination tends to suggest. The library declined gradually, through a combination of underfunding, political instability, and a series of damaging events spread across several centuries. Julius Caesar's fire in the harbour in 48 BC, the decree of Theophilus in 391 AD, and the Arab conquest of Alexandria in 642 AD have all been blamed at various points, but historians largely agree that the reality was a slow erosion rather than a single moment of loss. The dramatic image of a great fire consuming the sum of human knowledge in one night is a powerful one, but it seems to be more myth than history. What remains true, however, is that the amount of texts that were destroyed, decayed, or went missing is enormous, and the consequences of that loss are very real. Records suggest that thousands of books that were housed in the library have been lost forever. Overall, the Great Library is one of the more complete wonder designs in Civilization VI. Its bonuses cover science, literature, and the broader abstraction of knowledge, which maps well onto what the Library of Alexandria actually was. An institution that shaped the intellectual output of the ancient world and tried to preserve countless amounts of ancient texts and discoveries. All in all, I believe the designers did a great job at translating this ancient wonder in terms of Civ VI's gameplay. We don't even have to change cities to visit the next wonder in our list. Looking at the harbour of Alexandria, we can spot a giant that in many ways symbolizes the wealth that flowed towards the city. For centuries, sailors approaching Alexandria would look up to see a marvel of ancient engineering rising above the horizon. This was nothing else than the Great Lighthouse, a shining beacon more than 100 meters tall, one of the tallest buildings of its time. Also known simply as the Pharos, named after the small island it was situated on, it is most likely the most famous lighthouse in the history of humanity. Built during the reign of Ptolemy II Philadelphus in the 3rd century BCE, near the harbour of Alexandria, the tower served as a guide for ships approaching the city. Ancient writers describe it as visible from enormous distances out at sea, leading sailors safely into one of the busiest ports of the Mediterranean. But what features could Civilization VI attribute to this wonder, and what can we learn from them? In Civilization VI, the Great Lighthouse provides the following bonuses: +1 movement for all naval units, +3 gold, and +1 Great Admiral point per turn. You may notice that the Great Lighthouse's bonuses are very similar to that of the Colossus. I don't think that's a coincidence, and the explanation becomes more obvious when we compare the respective cities where the wonders were built. So let's take a brief look at the history of ancient Alexandria. The city was founded in 331 BC by Alexander the Great, who has a habit of appearing in these wonder explanations. Named after himself, of course, his aim was to create a center of Hellenism in Egypt's coast. While Alexander would never return to the city again, his wish very much came true under the leadership of the Ptolemaic dynasty, which inherited part of Alexander's conquests after his death. Ptolemy I Soter declared himself pharaoh of that kingdom and announced Alexandria to be its capital. The city developed incredibly fast. In the span of just one generation, it had already become the most populated city in the world, a title that it would keep until Rome surpassed it. The early Ptolemies wanted Alexandria to be the scientific and cultural hub of the world, and funded the construction and maintenance of the Great Library of Alexandria, which I have already went over. An equally important aspect of the ancient city was that it was one of, if not the largest, economic hubs of the Mediterranean Sea, and this is where the Great Lighthouse comes into play. See, until the founding of Alexandria, Tyre was the largest trade port of the area. Well, Alexander the Great famously conquered and looted the city, so some other place had to take its place as the center of commerce between Europe and Asia, and Alexandria was perfectly situated for the role. One of Ptolemy I's actions as pharaoh was to commission a lighthouse, since what would such an important port be without one? The construction cost 800 talents, which in today's money would be a lot, and it finished after 12 years, under Ptolemy II Philadelphus. The tower's architect or main sponsor was probably Sostratus, and the height of the finished wonder was measured at around 100 meters, from later Arab sources, something that would place it comfortably among the tallest buildings of antiquity. Strabo, who has also become a recurring character, notes that the lighthouse was very needed, since it wasn't very easy to navigate to Alexandria by traveling along the shore. This meant that sailors had to be able to spot the port of Alexandria from a long distance, in order to sail smoothly to it. It's no question that the Great Lighthouse went above and beyond when it comes to that purpose. And many sailors from all around the Mediterranean would indeed be guided by the lighthouse's beacon, as Alexandria quickly developed to be one of the most important economic centers of the world at that time. From a preserved papyrus, we know that Ptolemy II had issued a decree that all foreign merchants were required to exchange their gold and silver for new Ptolemaic silver coins in order to make their purchases in Alexandria and the rest of the country. In the same document, the one in charge of Alexandria's mint notes that the sheer amount of foreign coins that entered the city was far too much for the mint to be able to keep up with these exchanges. From this complaint, it's obvious that the amount of trade that passed through Alexandria was immense. It was basically the bridge that connected Europe to Arabia and India, and the amount of wealth that came from trade reflected that. I think that just like the Colossus, the gold bonus of the Great Lighthouse of Alexandria reflects the prosperous economic and trade hub that the city grew to be while the wonder overlooked its port. The Great Admiral bonus again mirrors the Colossus and can be explained in a similar manner. One of the great ambitions of Ptolemy II was for his kingdom to be the major naval power of the Eastern Mediterranean. His father had suffered a crushing defeat at Salamina from the fleet of Antigonus, so this was also personal, and Ptolemy II made sure to create the largest naval fleet of the Hellenistic world. Archaeologist and professor Lionel Casson referred to that period as the greatest naval arms race in ancient history. Many of these ships would sail in and out of the port of Alexandria under the watchful eye of the Great Lighthouse, and we can assume that the bonus to Great Admiral generation is tied to that increased naval activity. This leaves the final bonus, the one granting +1 movement to all naval units. Well, it may be a bit of a reach on my part, but I think this could refer to the naval reach of the Ptolemaic Empire. The kingdom in its early stages was not that much of an empire, but rather a collection of strategic coastal settlements all around the Eastern Mediterranean, which were protected by the powerful Ptolemaic fleet. This required the fleet to be not only large but efficient, able to sail from port to port fast. The bonus could also be seen as a more general improvement on the city's maritime infrastructure. As mentioned before, it wasn't the easiest thing to navigate to Alexandria, so the Great Lighthouse was built in order to guide the ships to its shores through the shallow waters. In that way, we can argue that the lighthouse made sailing to Alexandria a much more efficient endeavor, thus justifying the bonus movement. The Wonder requires the celestial navigation technology. Ancient sailors at the time of Ptolemaic Egypt relied heavily on the stars for orientation at sea. A structure like the Great Lighthouse makes sense as an extension of this growing understanding of navigation and maritime travel. The technology basically represents civilizations becoming increasingly capable of navigating open waters with consistency. The tech doesn't fit perfectly with the Wonder perhaps, but at least it's semantically related to maritime activities, so we can let it slide. The Wonder must be built on coast adjacent to land and a harbour with a lighthouse. A very direct and logical requirement. The real lighthouse of Alexandria stood directly beside one of the most important harbours of the ancient world, and its entire purpose was to aid maritime traffic. Now, why would you need a tiny normal lighthouse to build a version 5 or 6 times larger? I'm not sure, and this is the third time I've been over this, so I'll just leave it at that, while showing the effects of the Great Lighthouse in Civilization V.
This lighthouse was the cynosure of all eyes.
The in-game quote is the smallest one so far, and comes from Henry David Thoreau, the American philosopher and writer best known for Walden. The word cynosure originally referred to the constellation Ursa Minor, which contains the North Star and was used for navigation. Over time, the word came to mean something that attracts great attention or serves as a guiding point. The word is also included in the book The Words You Should Know to Sound Smart. I couldn't figure out where exactly Thoreau used that quote, and to be honest, I think the quote was used exclusively because cynosure is a very strange and cool word, but yes, it fits nicely with the Great Lighthouse in any case. Like several other ancient wonders, the lighthouse sadly did not survive into the modern era. A series of earthquakes between the 10th and 14th centuries gradually damaged and eventually destroyed the structure. Some of its remains were later used in the construction of the citadel of Qaitbay, which still stands on the same site today. Even so, the influence of the Pharos lasted long after the tower itself disappeared. In fact, the very word Pharos eventually became synonymous with the word lighthouse in several languages. The Great Lighthouse is very similar to the Colossus in-game. However, I think the features are more fitting for the lighthouse than the bronze giant. Every bonus points towards the same central idea: maritime infrastructure, naval power, and commercial dominance. None of them feel too arbitrary, as they can be seen both as a representation of Alexandria during the Ptolemaic kingdom, as well as practical effects that would be derived from the existence of the lighthouse. It is a simple design, but sometimes that works best. Just a few miles south, in the drier environment of Nubia, we can encounter our next wonder, probably the most obscure one yet. As you sail south down the Nile, there is a strange mountain rising abruptly from the flat Nubian desert that surrounds you. This peculiar rock formation was seen as something much more than just a hill by the ancient Egyptians and the Kushites. It was believed to be the home of Amun himself, a sacred place where kings were crowned and divine authority was made visible on earth. It is called Jebel Barkal, and it was one of the holiest sites in Africa. We'll explore the ancient kingdom of Kush, a civilization very often overshadowed by their popular neighbor, Egypt, and we'll see how Jebel Barkal connects to their history. It probably is one of the most obscure wonders in Civilization VI, so let's see what we can learn of its history from how it has been implemented. In Civilization VI, Jebel Barkal provides the following bonuses: +6 iron per turn, and +4 faith to all cities within 6 tiles. Okay, so I will admit that I had no idea what Jebel Barkal even is, before seeing it in Civilization VI. Without looking into it, I assumed that it was an ancient mining complex or something like that, purely based on the iron that it provides in-game. Well, it turns out I was quite a bit off, but both the bonuses are very justifiable when looking at the actual history. However, it is impossible to talk about Jebel Barkal without going a bit in detail about the ancient kingdom of Kush, ancient Egypt, and how these two civilizations interacted for centuries. The rise of the ancient city of Napata in the 15th century BC around the hill of Jebel Barkal is a good place to start, although it is important to note that the rich history of the peoples of the area goes back thousands of years even before that. The city rose to prominence under the Egyptian pharaoh Thutmose III after the kingdom's conquests in the Nubian region against the kingdom of Kerma. Now, before going further, we need to quickly clear up some naming confusion, because the history of this region can get very messy very fast. Nubia is the broad geographical term used for the area south of Egypt, along the Nile, in what is now northern Sudan and southern Egypt. Over thousands of years, different kingdoms rose there, like the aforementioned kingdom of Kerma. So when people talk about the Kushites or ancient Nubia, they are often talking about overlapping cultures and kingdoms that existed in the same region across different periods of time. For simplicity's sake, I will be referring to all of these kingdoms as Kush from now on. So, let's go back to the early history of Napata, the city established in the shade of Jebel Barkal. During their occupation of the area, the Egyptians built a complex of temples below the hill, with the largest of them being a temple to Amun of Napata, a ram-headed version of the Egyptian deity. Even though Napata was primarily a Kushite city, it is very clear that Egypt heavily influenced it, especially through religion. However, the Egyptian New Kingdom collapsed and the Kushites returned to power in Napata and Jebel Barkal, establishing it as their capital. It is important to note that the Kushites continued to follow many Egyptian traditions as well as deities during this period. Kush actually conquered most of Egypt soon after, and ruled it during what we now call the 25th dynasty of Egypt. A series of Kushite pharaohs ruled over both Egypt and Nubia, who saw Napata as the heart of their large kingdom and made sure to expand Jebel Barkal and its importance. This dynasty would come to an end following a series of Assyrian invasions of Egypt, beginning under Esarhaddon in 671 BC and culminating in the sack of Thebes by Ashurbanipal in 663 BC, which finally drove the Kushites back south to their homelands. After this defeat, the kingdom of Kush largely retreated back into Nubia. The city of Napata was eventually sacked by the Egyptians around 590 BC, forcing the Kushites to shift their center of power towards Meroe, which later became their new capital until the kingdom's eventual fall. During that period, relations between the Kushites and the Egyptians were mostly peaceful, establishing trade with each other for many years. From then on, the Kushite culture would become increasingly separated from that of Egypt's, with all traditions like that of their warrior queens, the Kandakes, returning. However, Napata never stopped being an important Kushite cultural and religious center, a place where the leaders of Kush were both crowned as well as buried for centuries. So this was a very simplified version of the history of Kush, which I hope provides some context on the importance of Jebel Barkal. We can now look at the actual in-game effects, starting with the faith bonus. As mentioned, many temples were built under the shade of Jebel Barkal, with the Temple of Amun being the largest of them. Jebel Barkal was believed by the Egyptians to actually be the residence of the major deity. Even though the Kushites and the Egyptians were rivals for much of their history, the god Amun held importance to both of them. This led to the shrine in Napata being a very important feature that was cared for by both civilizations. Many rituals and ceremonies were held in the temples surrounding Jebel Barkal, with the hill itself being venerated for centuries, so I think that is more than enough to explain the faith bonus. The site was so important to the Kushites that even after moving their capital to Meroe, they would continue to bury their leaders in its outskirts for centuries. I think we can use this to justify the faith bonus radiating outwards towards your other cities, a symbolic way to show how central Jebel Barkal was to the people of Nubia and beyond. Now, the iron bonus requires us to shift focus a bit. This bonus is not directly referencing Jebel Barkal, but is instead based on the knowledge we have of the civilization that is associated with it, this time the Kushites. We have seen this kind of bonuses in the past, most notably so far with the Temenanki, whose effects mostly relate to the peoples of ancient Mesopotamia, rather than the wonder itself. So what do the Kushites have to do with iron? Well, it turns out that they had developed quite a reputation when it comes to it. After the relocation from Napata to Meroe, the Khuzaids started to produce more and more iron tools and weapons, something that was not that easy to find, especially for that time. Meroe was situated near large deposits of Ulitic iron ore, and apparently their blacksmiths were very experienced when it came to forging it. This surplus of iron, as well as gold, meant that the Khuzaids were very important trading partners to the Egyptians, the Greeks, and later the Romans. For Civ VI's purposes, it is obviously translated as the hefty +6 iron bonus that Jebel Barkal provides. The Wonder requires the iron working technology. This obviously ties into the earlier iron bonus, but it gives me an opportunity to talk about Nubia's relation to iron in the larger scope of history. The presence of iron working in Africa seems to be quite a controversial subject. The debate comes to whether the technique of smelting iron ore and producing tools with it came to Nubia through contact with the Mediterranean or arose independently. Archibald Sayce referred to Meroe as the Birmingham of Africa, because of all the iron slag that was found in the tombs located there, but this has started to be seen as somewhat of an exaggeration today. No matter the extent of the actual production of iron and the techniques used, it is inarguable that the Khuzaids are culturally tied to the metal, using it and trading it for centuries. The Wonder must be built on desert hills. Once again, a very literal placement restriction that makes absolute sense. Jebel Barkal is an isolated sandstone hill rising directly out of the Nubian desert. There isn't much abstraction happening here. I mean, look at it. It's the definition of a desert hill. The placement of it near the Nile, as well as the shade it provided in the otherwise flat desert, made it a perfect site for the temple complex and settlement that were built around it.
At the southwest corner, a large perpendicular mass of sandstone has become separated by a deep fissure from the body of the mountain. It has all the appearance of a colossal statue.
The in-game quote comes from Wallis Budge, the British Egyptologist and philologist who travelled extensively through Egypt and Sudan in the late 19th century. In this description, he is referring to the enormous rock spire protruding from Jebel Barkal. This spire resembled the Uraeus, the rearing cobra associated with Egyptian royalty, and also evoked the white crown worn by pharaohs. I think the quote captures the strange visual presence of the mountain itself and helps to explain why the Egyptians might have seen it as a monument in of itself, deliberately placed in the landscape. Like many ancient sacred sites, Jebel Barkal gradually declined after the collapse of the Khuzaid kingdom and the spread of Christianity through Nubia. Napata was looted various times by various factions. However, the mountain and its temple complexes still survive today in the form of ruins. Compared to some of the other wonders we've talked about, it is actually very impressive how much of it still remains. Although the effects of Jebel Barkal are a bit lackluster, I can't help but like it. If only for the fact that it was an excuse for me to learn more about the incredibly interesting history of the Kingdom of Kush. I've only just scratched the surface with this video, but trust me when I say that there is so much to talk about. And yet, for a very long time, Kush tended to exist in the shadow of Egypt in popular history. Part of that is simply because Egypt left behind an enormous quantity of surviving monuments and written records, while much of Kushite history was harder to reconstruct archaeologically. It doesn't help that a lot of what we know about it comes from Egyptian sources, which would obviously be biased. Jebel Barkal is a nice reminder that the ancient world was much larger and more interconnected than the handful of civilizations people usually focus on. Even if the wonder itself is mechanically simple in Civilization VI, I do appreciate that the game included it at all, because it shines a spotlight on a kingdom that absolutely deserves more attention. So these were all the wonders for this video. Some of you may notice that there are actually 6 more classical era wonders present in the game, but these will get their own video. As I said in the intro, delving into the history of these wonders and seeing how the developers did their best to represent it through the gameplay has given me a new appreciation for them. It's very easy to disregard its bonus as just mechanics, because ultimately, that is what interests you when playing a strategy game. However, I have found it very rewarding to dive below the surface and explore the rationale that went behind everything. Even if all this is purely speculative, it's an interesting exercise nonetheless. This was a compilation video, as I have made individual videos for each wonder I talked about here. So if you're interested in doing further reading, I have put the sources I used while researching on the description of each of those videos. Thank you very much for watching, and stay tuned for the next parts, where we will finally make our way to the Americas, India, and China, among others.